So I think the challenges that are facing contemporary cities today are much like the challenges that have always faced cities. And if we understand what is a city is not a dense built-up population in a particular location. It is not a particular type of architecture. It is not a series of buildings. It's the people who live in it. That's what makes a city. And people in their engagements with a city are transient. People move. The story of cities is not the story of buildings. The story of cities is the story of migrant populations. It's people moving in, settling, moving out, unsettling, moving somewhere else. And that either happens within a single person's lifetime, so they move to the city to study, for example, and then move out when they're having a family, or it happens over generations, where you've got generations of migrants moving to a city, establishing a family life. Maybe they move to another part of the city, maybe they move somewhere else. So this question of property within the city or within urban spaces has quite recently, and I'm speaking here from a development framework, has become one of permanence. Thinking about how can we make property permanent for as many people as possible in perpetuity. And thinking of the property through a lens of permanence might not be compatible with the idea of a city as one full of transient people, one full of people that move. And so I would say that the greatest challenges in thinking about urban property is thinking about tenure regimes, thinking about property systems that are amenable to every different type of person that comes into a city, and not assuming that everyone who comes will stay forever in the same kind of way. So it means having rental options, it means having ownership options, communal options, and all these other things. But the most important element within that is to ensure that those options are accessible to as many people as we possibly can make them be accessible to. Whenever I think of the word of the state, or when I use the word in my research, it's never a monolithic entity, it's never fixed. And so one of the elements and one of the ways in which it's not fixed is in this scalarity. But within every scale, it's not fixed either. Everything around property regimes is, for me, and within my research, is down to interpretation. So within every tier of government, every tier of the state, there's an interpretation and a reinterpretation of what is housing and what is property. So there's a lot of fluidity within that. So I wouldn't say that there's a fixed answer as to how can this tier of government look up and look down at the same time. It does both, and it can do both. And there are lots of examples where it does do both. It's not an either or option. And one example of this would be through participatory budgeting, for example, where you've got local governments, local officials who are choosing to develop a type of governance and a type of system that involves different people in something to do with the budget, an area that is traditionally closed off and only seen within the realm of the state or the particular tier of the state. So this idea of an inclusive citizenship or a substantive citizenship, as you called it, is perfectly possible within our design of systems. But it's not about a particular tier of government being held accountable over another tier of government. It's a collective effort. And it's possible for every tier within government to do both at the same time. It's not dichotomous as a relationship. So informality is just one way in which we can describe an alternative set of rules or systems and ways of living that are different to ones that might be prescribed by the state. Mm-hmm. It just means that they have either been designed not by the state or they've been designed in relation to the state. And if we understand informality as just a system of a set of rules and practices, then actually the ways in which that people negotiate with the state varies, and it doesn't have to be within this thing that we called informality. there are lots of different competing systems of rules, and the state's rules are just one of those systems. And so people use the systems that are available to them to get what they want, to negotiate a better deal for themselves. So one of the examples in my research in India, and you've mentioned some of them about squatting and so on. The other that I mention is vote bank politics. Now, vote bank politics wouldn't necessarily sit within our imaginations of this is an informal system and an informal way of working, but it's a means to negotiate with the state to get what you want. And by vote bank politics, I mean where, for example, there are a group of people who then will say to a local politician, I will vote for you, or I will vote for your party in exchange for these goods and services, or in exchange for not voting for your opponent. And that collective negotiation, that collective bargaining, is a group of people, let's call them the urban poor, who live in low-income housing schemes, who are negotiating with the state to get something that they would like. They don't have to revert back to this thing that we're calling informal. There are multiple systems of rules at play, and they choose which system is going to yield the greatest return for what they want. It's quite strategic and it's quite calculated. So by saying that, can informality then change how we negotiate with the states? Well, all of the rules, all of the systems that are available to us can affect our relationship with the state and can mean that we can renegotiate the terms of our citizenship with the state. So I think this idea of convergence is an interesting one. And I would say that for people who are living in so-called informal settlements, the greatest space of convergence with different actor bodies of the state is that they want to renegotiate their relationship. That is fundamentally it. And for a lot of people that might mean, I don't want to be raided by the police every month. That is not the relationship that I want to have with the state, and the police are a manifestation of the state. For the state, it might mean, I want this area to be beautiful, and I don't want the people who live here to sully that. But I also don't want them to live without services. I want them to live with humanity and with dignity. So how do we renegotiate the relationship between citizen and state? And that is ultimately where that convergence lies. The disagreements, of course, are in, well, what's the detail of that? What is the detail of that? What is the cost of that? The environmental cost, the economic cost, the political cost, the social cost. But ultimately, that's what it boils down to for me. It's renegotiating a social contract between a citizen and a member of the state, or an aspect of the state, and trying to find ground where we can live better together. But that process of negotiation is a slow one, it's a cumbersome one, and it's a deeply, deeply, deeply political one. And so where the state, I think, doesn't negotiate in good faith, by, for example, instilling tenure rules and saying you must live like this in this upgraded settlement that we are giving you, these are the rules and you have to live by them. That's not a good faith negotiation. That's telling people what they have to do. But a social contract is negotiated. So how do people then input into what are the rules that they're going to live by? What rules do they think is appropriate for their context? That's the space that I think these different actors need to come together and have much more of a discursive relationship around what is the new social contract of housing and property going to be. These negotiations happen all the time. They are ongoing negotiations. And I suppose that as a researcher, there'll be moments where I would be able to capture a moment in time to be able to interrogate a little bit deeper. So some of those moments would be around elections, where you can see the visible manifestations of these negotiations that are occurring because it's quite tangible, but it happens in an everyday kind of way. And so I know that other people in your lecture series have spoken a little bit about everyday resistance to the state, particularly in low-income housing and the urban poor, broadly speaking, as a group. So in those moments of resistance, what people might call resistance, I think I would see as an attempt to negotiate a better deal. So there's no one space. It's not everyone come together in this beautiful room and let's negotiate, let's make a deal. Because the terms and the context of it is going to change. Because if I go back to the first question that you asked me, cities are full of people that move. We're not necessarily here forever and in perpetuity for all of our future progeny to always live in this city in this way. And so as the context changes, we must find ways to continually renegotiate. So the challenge is not to necessarily end up at a settlement, but to always keep open the route to negotiation. So I'm a little bit of a traditionalist. I'll call myself that. I don't know if I'd be happy if other people call me that, but I would say I'm a little bit of a traditionalist. And so I'm led by my research questions. So my research questions in these studies have always been one that is primarily focused on uncovering layers of understanding. And the best way for me to do that is through ethnographic techniques, by spending extended periods of time in the places that I am researching, by adopting multiple different methods with the same people, often in the study, and try to unpack what are all of the ways in which people express their sense of citizenship through housing. What is their relationship to housing? And if I'd done a one-off interview and said, what is your relationship to housing? Okay, maybe you tell me something. But then I come back the next time and I see how you interact with others. And I ask you about it and then you tell me about it without me having a big script beforehand of 10 questions that I'm going to get through. It builds a relationship. And through that relationship building, which is what ethnography allows, I'm able to identify layers of people's relationships with property and the state and peel each of those layers away. The more often I go back, the more often I talk to people, the different kinds of methods that I use, I can see more and more of those layers becoming clearer. Let's go back to basics, right? What is property? Property is a social relationship. It's a type of social relationship. There is an agreement that we have made, you and me and several others, we have agreed that this thing, this building, this land is property and it has a value that's ascribed to it. Now we've come up with that as an agreement to understand that housing is property, that land is property. What a decolonial lens offers us is unpacking that very notion of who is it that determines what is property and who has been excluded from those conversations. Because it's an agreement. We have socially agreed that this thing is property. And if we take that decolonial lens that step further and apply it to land and apply it to housing, it's very difficult to come to the conclusion that land can ever be property. Particularly if we adopt an indigenous lens in regarding what is land. What is land and what is its value? And the idea that land has a fungible value, that is monetary, that has ownership rights and transferable ownership rights attached to it, that we then trade at an agreed price, that doesn't quite fit. So what a decolonial lens does, and I see it very much as a lens, it's a way to look at a problem and a question that we might be grappling with other lenses at the same time. It allows me, it allows anyone working in this space to unpack the fundamentals of who decides what is property, who decides what is its value, and who decides whether one can ever own it. And that decolonial lens, particularly from an indigenous perspective, I think gets us to the point where there is no ownership of land. There's custodianship of land. And there is a temporal dimension to that, there is a generational dimension to that, that we don't often deal with, encounter, acknowledge in traditional land tenure debates.
Thank you so much. This
Okay.
is a great conclusion.